Welcome everyone. Hi. I think I'm audible. You can hear me at the back, right? You can hear me? Yeah? Yeah? Awesome. Right, so the talk is titled Attacker Antics. Tom and I will be talking about 9 different TTPs, so techniques that the attackers used quite recently that we found were really sexy, were very interesting, and we were also allowed to share them with you. So we put them all together, and there's quite a lot to go through, so we might skip certain bits here and there, but all of this stuff is on the slides, and the slides will be released. So don't worry, just relax, sit back, and enjoy. All right, so without further ado, I'll let Tom introduce me for a change.
So, yeah, this is Bart. He's one of our incident response consultants. He's currently based out in Singapore, obviously from Poland originally.
A bit closer.
We hear me okay? Yeah? Cool. And we previously worked together over in the UK, in our management offices and for our previous organisation. He's currently trying to learn French to impress his wife, but I hear it's not going too well so far.
That's a brilliant introduction. I probably should have done it myself. Right, and here comes Tom. So Tom is our senior consultant. He's from England, but based in England as well, around London. He's been doing incident response and digital forensics for about 7 years. He's a big rugby fan, and he's also a keen rock climber. He claims I'm a little bit better at climbing, which I really don't buy into. But, you know, what do you know? And you can catch him on Twitter at thhall_sec. A quick disclosure statement, and that's something I'm going to read out to you. So all case studies and examples are drawn from our experiences and activities working for a variety of customers and do not represent our work for any one customer or a set of customers. In many cases, facts have been changed to obscure the identity of our customers and the individuals associated with our customers. Right, so these are the 9 TTPs, and we're just going to dive into the first one. Over to you, Tom.
All right, so just as the first one, we're going to go through an incident where we saw the AV server used as a deployment mechanism. So what we saw was the attacker using a number of backdoors, including one that will be familiar to a lot of you here, obviously with Cobalt Strike. On the blue team side, it's quite useful for us. We have a randomized service name which we can trigger on. It's calling base64 encoded PowerShell. It's fairly kind of standard stuff, right? But it's useful for the attackers because it's resident in memory. They can kind of move laterally with SMB. But what's really interesting in this instance is how they spread the malware across the organization. So obviously we'd seen kind of PowerShell being spawned, so we had a look on the network. And what was really interesting is we saw that the McAfee EPO server, so that's the kind of the main distribution point in the enterprise for the AV, was serving up a PowerShell script, which you can see just up here, running from DLP agent install 0409 kb.ps1. Now, when we looked at the script itself, it's quite interesting because we saw that there were similarities between some of the Cobalt Strike payloads we'd seen previously. What's really kind of different here is we can see from the signature field that it's actually signed by the EPO server itself. So they've legitimately got the EPO server to serve this script up. So looking kind of the next steps of the investigation, we turn to the EPO server itself and kind of obviously surprise, surprise, we found the PowerShell script in the repository where we previously seen it. And when we were kind of pivoting around, looking around what happened at the same time, we saw there was also a RAR file. Now obviously, for us, this is quite interesting. It's not something we've really come across before. So we did a bit of background research. It turns out in 2013, Jerome Nokin gave a talk on effectively using AV as a botnet kind of within an organization. So kind of a mass deployment kind of tool. And he's provided on GitHub a tool called ePolicyOwner, which is obviously free to grab. Take a look at it. It's really cool stuff. But it looks like obviously our attackers have got some ideas, maybe kind of similar to this. So kind of we took a kind of a deeper dive really into the functionality. And what you can see here is the tool itself is effectively putting on a few files, catalog.z, pkg, catalog.z, and essentially kind of serving them up to the EPO server and reconfiguring it to kind of take control and serve up any kind of files that they want. And using the kind of the file command, what it'll do is it will create a batch script, run.bat, which will basically just serve up any script that you pass to it. So, right, that's pretty cool. It seems similar. So we go back to the EPO server and we find this RAR file. And as you can see here, there's some similarities, right? We've got our catalog.z, we've got our PowerShell script that we saw served up over the network, and we've also got our run.bat. So it's looking pretty similar so far. So take a deeper dive, and again, look, as we can see, it's effectively launching this PowerShell script, running it locally across all the servers, and it's authenticated from the AV. So it bypasses most of the security logging you'll probably have in place, and it also gets around most of the firewall blocks, right? Because you want to have your AV administered across the enterprise, so you're not going to be blocking it from communicating with all your endpoints. So pretty cool, pretty different.
Thank you, Tom. Right, so the next TCP is called Stealing Secrets from Air-Gapped Networks. It's based on an investigation that we did for a client who had two physically separate networks. The first, as we mentioned, was air-gapped, meaning it had no internet connection, and the other was the everyday network. And to move data between the two, for convenience reasons, they decided to use USB devices. And I think they suspected that someone might be after them, so they did research in the local market and chose a vendor who was selling highly secure USB devices. And as we looked into it, they worked just like normal devices, but they came with the software provided by the vendor, some kind of proprietary software that allowed the user to create encrypted containers, a little bit like TrueCrypt, on the device. And so the user could store just any document they wanted on the device, and that would be just stored like a typical USB device. But there was also a container that was highly secure, as the vendor claimed. And then to open that up, you needed the software that came with the USB device, and you could only interact with that container using that software, which makes a big difference between your TrueCrypt or the others, where you mount it as a drive, and then you can use any software to move the data in and out. Here, you had to use their software to open the files, place the files in, that kind of things. Right, so I mentioned it was highly secure, so the vendor said it was unbreakable. It was using 256 AES, so highly strong encryption, and it was all closed source. It was never released to anyone, so the format was proprietary. And as we did the investigation, because the client discovered they have a problem on the network, we started unraveling a story that showed us that the attackers staged it into 3 different phases. The first phase was locating systems of interest. Makes sense, right? Internal reconnaissance, looking for any documents that they may want to steal. Second phase was researching what security measures the victim has in the network so they can try to attack that. And the last stage was obviously, once they knew how to do it, breaking that security. And this is kind of how we're going to go about it. An extra point, the activity was attributed, or we attributed, to a group known as TIC. And we have a slide about it, but you can also Google them. There were some papers or blog posts in 2016 and then again in 2017 about the group. So first, we found that the attackers came to the environment and dropped 2 tools. One of them is Nirsoft USB Deview, which is a free utility. Some of you might know it, and it's a GUI utility that opens registry in various other places to tell you what USB devices are currently connected, as well as what devices were connected in the past. And that was useful for the attacker because once they knew that the data was moved on the USB devices, it was just a matter of time before they identified all the key systems of interest. Now, what we didn't know was that they would just place the utility on the disk and run a scheduled task, and then in the command prompt, they would say, hey, just output everything to a TXT file. Then they would come around, grab that file, and then analyze it offline. So something we didn't know was that it supports command line arguments, and it's not just a GUI utility. The second thing was what we dubbed a detectmon, and essentially it was a self-contained exe file that was persistent on the system, and it would just run and do nothing, except anytime a USB device is connected, it would run a dir command and pipe it to a file on disk, right? The location was hard-coded into the malware, and it would run that command every 3 minutes, so that later when the attacker comes to the system and grabs those text files, he knows what content was on the disk. So they're not stealing the data yet, they're just kind of checking what is available to them. That's what Nirsoft USB Deview looks like. You can find it on the internet. And in the next phase, they realized, okay, so there are these USB devices in the network, and the problems they were facing were obviously strong encryption. There was unknown file formats when it comes to the encryption container. Then we have no disk mapping, like I mentioned earlier. And lastly, there might be, and this is what we suspect, that the USB devices had encryption chip that ensured that if someone steals the encrypted container and they have the password, they still won't be able to access that container because the key is probably split between the chip and the password. So that's what we suspected. We never got a chance to confirm that. How could the attacker get around it? Well, fairly simple, right? It doesn't matter how strong the encryption is as long as you have the password. The file format, well, we're talking about state-sponsored attackers, so they could have reverse engineered it. They also could have used APIs if those are available by the vendor. And then other things like if there is no mapping, like TrueCrypt, they can perhaps dump the process while the user is interacting with the container to extract the encryption key, or maybe other secrets that allow the interaction. And lastly, if the USB device did have that chip that we mentioned earlier, they could automate the process and just wait until the chip is inserted and then access and steal the data. So these were kind of theories how they could get around it. And once we found the software that we dubbed them as Shell that was actually specifically created to do that, we did some analysis to understand how they do it, right? So the report came back and they said, the team that did analysis, they said, hey, in the first phase, anytime a USB device is connected, it hashes all the files on disk and compares the hash to a hard-coded one. Only once that match is found, it moves on to the second stage. So obviously the question was what it's looking for, right? We entered the hash into Google, nothing came up. And then as I started feeding the reverse engineering team the various file names that we expected, and they said, hey, there is a match. I can't really tell you what the match was, but what it turned out later was that there was some trickery by the attackers to make this process more difficult, and there's a slide about it. So once a match was found, they come to the second stage, which is looking for a very specific file extension. Once it's found, they check if the file is at least 4 meg, and then they move to a third stage. So the first one is looking for the software. That's what they were looking for, the software that the vendor provides. Second one was making sure that there is a volume, right? The container, the encrypted container. And lastly, once the two conditions were met, the malware would extract from itself 4 different versions of the vendor's software and automate trying to break into the container with each version until one of them worked. Some clever tricks, and you can tell that it wasn't like a 5-minute thing. They clearly researched the thing, and they had to also buy the USB devices because that software that the vendor provides, it crashes. It won't work unless the USB device is inserted. And here comes the bonus point. The software that I mentioned earlier, or I should say a piece of malware called Decompressed, at some point got also updated by the attacker because they realized that sometimes the victim doesn't put all the files into container. Sometimes they just put on the USB device. So instead of doing dir every 3 minutes, they just use xcopy command, again, built-in command, to copy all the files from the USB device, excluding certain that were listed in a text file. So a very, very interesting command. I wasn't even aware of it. And the text file had things like Adobe Reader, surprisingly, there must have been a folder. The containers, right? So a file extension for the encrypted containers. Obviously, they didn't want those. They had no use of those. But also some file extensions that we never understood what they were because they were unique to the client's environment. Like I mentioned, Attribution, the group is known as TIC. We believe they're Chinese origin, and they've been active since at least 2009. Right, so I mentioned that there was some trickery. So throughout the investigation, we saw, or various investigations, we saw the operation security improve. And this is a great example of it. So when you think about an MD5 algorithm, it consists of 4 different rounds. And something that really kudos to the reverse engineering team, they spotted that there was a small change. In round 3, one of the constants had one of its bytes changed, which meant that anytime you hash something, the output will be different than from original MD5. And that was just so that when you Google that hash that was hard-coded, you wouldn't find any hits in Google. At least that's our theory. Right, back over to you, Tom.
Great, cheers, Bart. So quickly jumping in then, we're going to look at a DNS backdoor. So This is SOUNDBITE. It's a backdoor we've seen used by APT32, solely should add by APT32, or a Vietnamese-based threat group that we track. It's a fairly kind of advanced backdoor. What's interesting here is it actually uses recursive DNS servers. So in an environment where you don't have really good detailed DNS logging, it's very difficult to track the source and destination of these beacon packets. Kind of got kind of the expected kind of functionality of an advanced backdoor, and obviously kind of the aim for the attackers really is to divert things like proxy, firewall rules, and be able to get out of the environment kind of as easy as possible without alerting the kind of the security teams. So jumping into kind of a beacon example. So what it does is it uses null resource records with DNS. It also uses a custom base 64 dictionary. What we can see here in yellow, the first 6 bytes is it stores a host identifier so that the C2 knows which system it's talking to. But what's kind of interesting here is, although it makes it easy to identify the source host for us when we're looking at on the network, it also, because it stores it in the registry and it only stores it once, it gives us an indication of when that system was first compromised. And in blue, we can see here, we've got a tick counter. So every beacon that comes out, obviously if you have a number of beacons at set intervals, it's quite easy to detect kind of through your DNS logs when you've got multiple requests to one domain. What it does is it makes that domain unique. So if you're trying to stack on the network logs kind of suspicious kind of DNS lookups, you're just going to see these as individual records. So it's an example of some of the commands that it supports. We're going to take a quick look at the move file. We can see here. Well, what it does, as you can see, is it takes arg0 and arg2, and it effectively takes 2 files, and it tells the endpoint to kind of move the first file to the second file. So just as an example, kind of before we get to the base 64 kind of encoding of what it looks like as a C2 command, and we can see here on the first bytes, we've got the actual command itself, which kind of, as we just said, we're looking at the move file. Then following that, we've got 2 sections which represent the compressed and the decompressed size. So we've got error checking in there. They can see if there's been any kind of issues with kind of transporting the data over the network. And then finally at the end here, we've got the actual compressed data itself, which, as you can see here, we've got the header to indicate the start of that data. What's interesting is, not kind of supported here, but these bytes here, these FF bytes, if we've got larger commands that need to go over multiple requests, because obviously we've only got a set length for DNS records, we can kind of have a continuous stream where we can verify which point we get to the end of that message. So kind of breaking that down a bit and kind of decompressing it, we can see here the arguments are stored as length value pairs. So arg0 here is highlighted. We can see we've got one file, which is represented here, desktop old file. We've got our arg1, which isn't implemented for this command, and is just kind of passed over, followed finally by arg2, which effectively takes old file and moves it to new file. Fairly simple stuff, but it's an interesting way, obviously, of using DNS to kind of divert from normal kind of C2 kind of practices. So lastly, just to look at some of the host-based indicators. What this attacker likes to do is they like to kind of disguise themselves with standard kind of Windows file names and folder structures. So the first sample we found is this soundvol.sso.exe, which is where the SOUNDBITE naming came from. There's a legitimate DLL file with the same name. What we'll find is interesting here is they've got unsigned droppers. With, in the PE resource data of that, we have the actual backdoor itself, which is self-signed by the attackers, but impersonating Microsoft. So again, trying to kind of hide and kind of camouflage themselves in the network. As we said in the registry key, they're storing the host indicator, and they're both samples are persistent as a service. So here we're using .NET. Legitimate file names, they just change the version numbers.
Right, so the next section, which is TP number 4, is hidden comment that can haunt you. So I'll start with a little bit of a quiz to wake you guys up, to make sure you're still listening, you haven't fallen asleep yet. So I'll tell you a story we came to investigate the server, and we found a bit weird that the attackers took the main page, let's call it index.php. They made a copy of it so we could diff them, and in the original index, they appended 4 lines that we represented here in a pseudocode. And as you can see, all it does is it queries the local time on the system, converts that into number of ticks, and then that into minutes. So that's what you have. You have total minutes, and then it just kind of removes the least significant digit, right, by dividing by 10. And then appends it to a string and prints it out. So effectively, when you browse to a page, you won't see it at all unless you go into HTML code, and then all you see is a HTML comment as presented in the example. So, any suggestions? Why would the attackers done that? Anyone? This is the interactive part. Yes? To do what? As a seed. Okay, yeah, that's a great idea. And then you could use that seed for? Sorry? Right, so the idea, great thinking. So the idea is that you get some kind of random number generator, right? Yes? So the idea is that it would bypass detection. And what are we trying to detect? The full ID. And what would anyone use a GUID? Because it's effectively a GUID, right? What do you need a GUID for? So what I'm going here with, it's a great idea. There were even ideas of, hey, maybe it's preventing caching because every time the page will be unique, or at least every 10 minutes. So we had these ideas, but we didn't really know what it was for, right? So yeah, thank you for your ideas. And before I tell you why they did it, let me tell you a story about web shells. So obviously it's a technical conference, so all of you know what web shells are, right? Are they just web-based backdoors? Very difficult to detect for a number of reasons. They're passive in a sense that they don't beacon out. You have to connect to them as the attacker. And like I said, they can really vary in size. They can be even as small as 20 bytes. If you Google, and I'm sure you know it, there are like hundreds of different web shells. And here is an example of a China chopper. So very commonly used backdoor. At the top, you have a source code of a file that was placed on the victim system, right? The actual web shell, very short. And at the bottom, you have the attacker's screen using the thick client, which looks very much like just Explorer. Just clicky, beautiful, you just go around and you do nasty things. Now, what does it look like on the wire? So on the top, we have the request sent to the web shell by the attacker. It's just your typical post request with a very big chunk of base 64 that gets decoded on the victim system and executor, right? And then we have a response at the bottom from the victim. Now, coming back to the original story, a little bit later, we found another file that we missed at first because it was timestamp, right? So its timestamps were altered. And inside, we found 10 lines of code. The first 4 were practically identical, like the ones they appended earlier. But now, instead of printing it out as a comment, the value of time is appended to a text, which in this example is ABC123. And then it's compared with a cookie. And if the cookie doesn't contain the right value, the user is redirected. Which effectively means that if you want to use the web shell, you need to know the password and the current time on the system, put them in the cookie, and only then you can interact with the web shell. A bit of a one-time password, right? Pretty cool. At least we thought it was. Click it.
So moving on, we're going to look at a persistence technique that we haven't seen used too much. So again, kind of staying on the theme of APT32, we've got another backdoor, highly kind of functional, called KOMPROGO. So it's a free kind of stage backdoor, as you see quite commonly. You've got a persistence mechanism, you've got a loader, and you've got a payload, right? So we first took a look at this, and we saw that it was using this improc server 32, right? So first thoughts, is it COM object hijacking? I don't know. It's quite common. We see it quite a lot. But kind of digging deeper into it, we saw actually it's using this registry key, auto dial DLL, to persist. So we did a bit of research. There's not too much written about it. We saw it briefly mentioned in one blog here. We did some kind of auto runs testing. It was kind of hit and miss as to whether or not we detected it. But essentially, every time the WinSock library is loaded, it's looking in this registry key for a DLL, which is typically kind of a Windows-based, legitimate, signed DLL. It's loading it, and it's expecting these three export functions. So what we found is they're replacing, overwriting this registry key with their malicious DLL, which then, when every time the WinSock library is loaded, it's loading their malicious DLL, which is loading the payload, but it's also allowing the WinSock library to function kind of as it would do normally. And that's kind of just another bit, but we'll kind of touch on that further on in one of the other slides.
Right, this TDP number 6 is called Securing Corporate Email is Tricky. And as you well know, most attackers have various objectives. And a common objective often is reading victims' emails. Because A, perhaps that's where a lot of sensitive data goes through. And B, if the security team is against them or is looking for them, then they can be a step ahead by reading the emails. So most environments run using Exchange Server and Active Directory, and the common angles or attack angles that we observe are mailbox exporting, which means taking a whole email inbox offline, making a copy of it, analyzing it, setting up inbox forwarding rules or transport rules, meaning forwarding any emails of interest from victim inboxes, and also things like mailbox delegation, which means that the user A can access email of user B, right? So these are very common tactics. What is less common are SAPI filters, which are effectively plugins for Microsoft IIS Server. And we've seen a group that used them to capture credentials when the users were logging in into OWA, as well as Exchange Transport Agents, which are effectively plugins for Exchange Server. And these have been around since at least 2010. We've seen some that were compiled in 2008, if we can believe the timestamps, and they are less known. Now, here's a story of an investigation where we responded and we came across highly sophisticated malicious transport agents. It was split into 3 components. The first component had an agent. Well, we'll call it agent.dll. And this is the transport agent that they installed. It was very small. You could easily decompile it. It was written in .NET, and it followed the template that's on the next slide. All it did was it would load the mining DLL, which is the big component that did all the work. And it will pass details from every single email that goes in and out of the environment to the mining component. That's all it did. The mining component, on the other hand, was highly sophisticated. It was protected on disk. It had a separate config file that the attackers updated at some point. It would load it up, and that configuration file would say things like, hey, store any emails that go into these inboxes into disk in encrypted form. And they were using public and private key encryption. They were also doing things like, if the server runs out of space, it reaches 10% of free space, stop mining, log any errors to a file. And it was highly configurable. One of the other brilliant things that these hackers did was they set up like a God email address, where they said anytime anything comes from that email address, take the body of the email and run it as a script, which essentially gave them remote access to the system. So really, really clever. And obviously the last point was something that would steal those emails. And for that, they set up WMI persistence. They regularly would run script that was encoded. Well, it was stored in a bit of obfuscated way in the registry. And that script had a lot of anti-VMware methods. And one of them was, for instance, checking the parent process so that if it didn't match WMI, it would terminate. So that even if you find it and you put it in a sandbox environment, it won't really execute. Right, so like I said, this is the template on the right side. It's very, very simple, and that's exactly what the attackers followed. And then there are things that both red team and blue team could be on the lookout for. The 3 commandlets. There is one for installing transport agents. Once you install it, you have to enable it. And then obviously one for getting transport agents. And besides looking for those 3 in event logs, you can also review Exchange Server configuration file called agents.config. And if you don't have a way to automate it, then maybe acquiring it across the environment and diffing would be another way to discover any discrepancies. So were the attackers successful? Well, they introduced encryption. They had a kill switch. They also had anti-analysis and even an uninstall function in the code. So I would say, yeah, pretty secure. It was highly configurable, like I said earlier. It was very extensible with 3 completely independent components. They were forgiving, meaning they were logging all the errors, and it was pretty automated. So yeah, I would say, you know, full software development lifecycle here by the attackers.
So what we're going to look here is a little nod to the obfuscation. We're going to look at some of the ways that SOUNDBITE and KOMPROGO have kind of utilized kind of hiding effectively from the security team. So a bit of interaction. One of these is a malicious service. For the top one, hands up anyone who thinks this is the malicious service. Yeah? Bottom one? Anybody? Quite difficult, right? But
there was one person who thought it was the bottom, at the back.
Oh, we got one.
I agree with you. It's the bottom one.
Slightly easier, right, if we look at the image path, right? Bottom one, it's pretty bad, right? Considering if you were paying attention to the previous kind of HPIs for SOUNDBITE. But obviously, one of the issues we've got here is we can't have 2 services with the same name. So if they're loading their tools on your system, we get a conflict, which obviously we don't want. It creates event log errors. It causes obviously kind of suspicion from the security team. So what we saw them using is no break space. So it's a Unicode character. It's commonly interpreted by most applications as a space. So at the end of the service and display names, they put one of these characters here. And when you're looking at it kind of with your standard kind of applications, it looks just like a normal kind of service name, and you've got no real idea, obviously, that it's hiding their malicious payload. But then we take a look at KOMPROGO. So as we discussed, they're using autodial DLL for persistence, and they're updating the registry key. Now, you could quite easily, obviously, put in any kind of file name you like, but it's a bit obvious. So what they like to do is they like to use the same naming scheme, but obviously you can't have more than one file name, one kind of file in the system without overwriting it. So what they use here is an operating system command. Now, obviously, they could use no break space, but it kind of looks a bit obvious because then you have your space before your dot. It kind of sticks out a little bit. But unlike the no break space, the operating system command is not actually interpreted by most applications. So it just looks like a standard RSA DHLP.dll. So they can persist within the registry key with their malicious DLL, but it looks no different to the kind of standard kind of technique the operating system uses.
Thanks, Tom. Right, so that brings us to TP number 8, which is about, well, avoiding static IOCs. So a quick reminder, right? Everyone knows what IOCs are. They are a way to describe threat data, things like malware, attacker TTPs, evidence of compromise, things like that. You know, we wouldn't be Mandan if we didn't mention OpenIOC, which was developed back in 2010. But obviously there are different standards, Yara, Sticks, you know, your cyborgs, and so on and so forth. What an IOC can look like, right? This is an example of OpenIOC one, where it uses a Boolean logic. At the top you have your OR statement, and then you have conditions. So to match, you would say file name is UDI32.exe, or file name is something, or, and you know, you can have nested conditions, negative checks, and so on and so forth. When you develop your IOC, it's a bit of a cycle, right? You start at the top and you go, we identify malicious activity, we move on, we collect and analyze data, then we move and we create IOC based on the findings, and then we sweep and we look for more. We tune it by reducing the noise, right? We fix false positives, and then we find more evil, right? At that point, the cycle repeats, and you look for more. That's kind of just a reminder to everyone. So let's go about an actual example where the attackers installed a malicious service that runs a DLL, and there are things that you can actually signature, right? So you can look at the DLL and say, okay, what are the static features I can signature? Maybe there is a unique export DLL name, or there are some version information details that I can signature, and I can look for that across the environment. Or perhaps I'll go after the service. Maybe the service is unique enough, right? Other things would be file properties. Perhaps the file was called svchost.exe and it was inflated. So you're looking at an SVC host over 100 meg. There are various properties that you can look for, or you can go for things like strings or unique functions. But checking that across the environment is obviously more costly than just looking at metadata. But there are many different ways you could signature. So in this example, we're looking at a highly sophisticated adversary who is placing various types of backdoor, and that code never repeated, even across single system, which meant signaturing was a little bit difficult. So in this instance, there is a DLL that's running as a Windows service, just like in the slide before, and they didn't set up any export function in the registry, so the export called service main will get executed. And when we looked, and also I should say, that DLL was packed, so there weren't any visible strings, and it was a custom packer. So there were no version information. If you look at sections over here on the left, all the section names look pretty standard. There wasn't really much standing out. And then when we thought about the export name, it says library.dll. Well, is it really unique or not? Arguable. And then when we look at the exports, we see that they're completely random, right? And every single variant had different export names, export functions, I should say. Now, what is really odd here is that service main isn't on the list. So how would that code, how would that DLL load if it executes service main function, but service main function isn't on the list? So with reverse engineering, we found out that when the DLL is loaded, before the function is actually executed, the export table gets replaced. So what we saw earlier was just a fake export table that's every time randomized, and only once the DLL is loaded, it replaces its own export table, which allows it to execute. So very, very tricky and difficult to signature if you only use your static IOCs.
So just to wrap up, we're going to take a quick look at some DDE samples. Originally, I guess we first saw this written about by Context about 2014 time. As you can see here, SensePost blogged about it in 2016. And then again, October 2017, we see a big uptick in activity because obviously they're writing about how we can use DDE to execute code in Office documents without using macros. So we thought, all right, well, there's got to be some stuff out there. So we wrote a Yara script and we started hunting through VirusTotal. So we pulled the first one. Well, it's not very interesting, right? We're just calling calc. It's a bit boring. So we carry on hunting. All right, well, we've obviously got some elite hackers here. They're adding a local user account, hacker, password. They might have read that one on the internet somewhere. So we keep going. Somebody's running ipconfig. There's no output, right? Not very interesting. So we carry on looking through VirusTotal. We get a hit. This looks a bit more fun, right? We're calling a remote object. So we pull the file, take a look at it. Oh, just a lol face. So we carried on looking, and what we found here is they're using a way of bypassing application whitelisting. So what the attackers here are doing on the sample we found on VT is they're using a signed WSH script, which allows them to run their own script without it going through exploit guard on Windows. So it's a pretty cool technique. Subt's written about it. We've seen it a few times. But kind of moving on a bit more, we track Fin7, or a financially motivated group, and what we saw is a phishing campaign that they ran. And here you can see they're using Power Source, again, kind of DNS C2s. Really interesting again, but what's really cool is kind of the agility some of these groups have. Now, obviously, kind of the eagle-eyed kind of guys in the audience, or girls in the audience, would have spotted that the SensePost blog post was written on the 9th of October. And by the 10th of October, Fin7 had created a Word document, and they're using a phishing campaign and kind of potentially effectively infiltrated a few organizations.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. Right, so that's really it. I'll just quickly summarize and recap the things we went over. So in point number 1, we went about, say, AV server distributing malware for the attackers. A bit funny. In the second one, we have breaking the secure USB devices to ruin the air-gapped network. In point number 3, we went about SOUNDBITE, which is APT32 malware that was using DNS for C2. In point number 4, we went about a web shell that required an OTP to allow the attacker in. Point number 5, we talked about a fairly uncommon persistence mechanism. Point number 6, we talked about transport agents and how the attackers use those to steal emails. Point number 7, we talked about special characters that the attackers used to blend in and disguise themselves. Point number 8, we talk about how creating good signatures can be very difficult when the attackers really try hard to hide themselves. Point number 9, we talked about agility of the attackers and how they can adapt and use the new techniques even within 24 hours and use them to target victims. So that's all from us. I don't know if we have time for questions. 2 questions? All right. Well, then we'll open to questions. No questions? I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. All right. Well, in that case, thank you very much.
Thanks for your time, guys.